The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas is a short story by philosopher and science fiction writer Ursula K. Le Guin, and it involves several layers of defamiliarization. As with all science fiction, we have to first establish where we are, and that can mean literally what planet, or it can mean figuratively if we're in a different mindset or arrangement or society. And all of that comes into play here. Another layer of defamiliarization is language. Just like when we read Shakespeare, depending on the author we read, when we're reading science fiction or some other genres, we have to sort of decipher some of the language. And part of that language is the specific terminology. Now, in this case, this is a pretty transparent use of language. We don't have technologies or names or proper nouns or anything that we have to kind of decipher, except for the word Omelas itself, which we just know is the name of the city. And the most important layer of defamiliarization is the entire concept behind the short story. Of course, the fact that they are extremely happy, but they have this child in the basement. How do we reconcile that? A couple of points in the story that I always enjoy seeing are this line here about how good is boring, and we only consider evil to be interesting. And in the short story, this is kind of a warning. This idea that we feel like someone who is purely happy or a society with no problems is suspect, or it can't be true, right? And of course, in our world, that tends to be the case. There is no such society. And this brings us to the concept of utopia, which I'm sure we have seen before. Notepad that out. That's utopia, of course, which comes from the Greek, I believe, is originally, I don't think it's Latinate, and that's topos, which can mean no place, and that's where we get it from, this idea that it is a place that does not exist, right? But of course, in English, the prefix "u," as in euphemism, can mean good. You may have taken philosophy, or rather psychology, and you may have seen this word eustress as opposed to distress. Dis, of course, means bad, generally, as a prefix in English, and eu means good, or satisfactory. So eustress is actually a type of stress, like when an athlete experiences anxiety before an event. That can actually help the athlete perform better. That can be eustress, stress that is good. So utopia can mean a place of perfection, a good place, but when we get it from the Greek, the actual etymology of the word means no place, and that's fitting because places that are perfectly good do not exist, right? And Omelas at first appears to be a utopia, and only when we get down to the end, the author asks us, the writer asks us, do you believe, do you accept the festival, the city, the joy? No, because she knows that we do not believe in that. Any place that is perfectly good is unbelievable. We cannot credit it. So of course then we discover the child in the basement, and this is the horrific truth, literally underneath this shining, beautiful city where everyone else is happy and has perfect lives. And if we look at the word utopia, just as dis is bad and u is good, we can see the word dystopia, which we probably have heard before. A dystopia, or a dystopian city or place, is a place that appears to be a utopia at first glance, but is in actuality, it seems to be good, but it is actually a dystopia. It's actually bad. And of course, that is what we see here. And utopias in literature almost always turn out to be dystopias. Very frequently we see setups that are supposed to be perfect, but then we discover some horrible secret or some rot beneath the surface, and that is what happens here. America is often thought of as a land of promise or a land of freedom, right? All this, the American propaganda and ideology, of course, the American dream, this is what we've always wanted to think of ourselves as. But of course, we live in America and we know that we are not a perfect place. We have problems and challenges, and part of the point of Omelas is these people who walk away from Omelas. the ones who walk away from Omelas, they are the ones who cannot bear the child in the basement, who see the suffering that their happiness depends on, and they cannot bear it. They literally walk away and they go out into the darkness. They go towards the mountains. They don't know where they're going. They know that it's not going to have the same level of happiness. They may die, they may struggle, but they know also that they're not going to be dependent anymore upon that child. Now, I'm not saying that there's a right or wrong here. The people who stay and are happy, the people who leave. But I want you to think, what would you do? Would you walk away from Omelas, or would you stay? I normally ask that in a journal prompt, and I get overwhelmingly the response of, I would walk away. I would never allow that kind of suffering to underpin my happiness. But of course, that's a lie. And if you think that, then that's a lie, because simply by being in this class, you are depending upon the child in the basement. So and this can take many forms. There's an opinion article from 2015 here, and I've linked this on our Blackboard page by David Brooks. And his point is that we all depend on this child in the basement. We tolerate exploitation. We buy a cell phone, a piece of cheap clothing. We know that there are sweatshops out there. We know that a lot of our labor, the labor that makes the things we rely upon and literally put on our bodies, is made in outsourced labor. And in some cases, the supply chains for those are not ethically managed, and there is suffering. There are warehouses where children suffer in terrible conditions or make very little money and are impoverished and essentially living in a state of slavery. This is real. This happens. So there is almost literally a child in the basement, and that clashes with our values, right? Brooks says, in theory, if I can do it, there we go, most of us subscribe to a set of values based on the idea that this is wrong, that it's wrong to have that child in the basement, but we don't actually live according to that, right? We don't see the child in the basement the way that the people of Omelas do. They go to the basement and they look at it. They all know it is there. They go there and they look at the child in the basement. We don't do that. We can't literally reach out and pick up the child and walk away and save the child, right? But we still depend upon that. So the question that the story asks us is, how do we reconcile that knowledge that we survive on the suffering of others for our own happiness? Because obviously we have to live with that every day. And we don't think about it most of the time, just as the people of Omelas, many of them do not think about it, even if they feel angry and they would like to help. They normally don't think about it. But we have to reconcile that, right? We can't just pretend like it doesn't exist. I mean, I guess we can, but then who would we be? And even if we don't want to think about internationally, even in our everyday lives here in America, we do rely on the suffering of even ourselves and others because we subscribe to utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is simply the good of the many, prioritizing the good of the many. That's a philosophy that says the best thing to do, if we are a government and we're making policy and setting up rules, the best thing to do, the best rules are those that benefit the many as opposed to the few. So for example, we all know that there are speed limits, and the speed limits on the freeway system vary anywhere from 65 to like 80 miles per hour by state and by area, but the speed limit, you may have heard the term double nickel speed limit, and that's when the speed limit used to be 55. If you've ever driven or been in an old car, you may see the 55 on the speedometer highlighted. Like, why is that? Normally it's just, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, but the 55 in older cars is highlighted, and that's because the speed limit used to be 55 on the interstate system. But as cars became safer and faster and we became more impatient, we have gradually increased those. And even recently, in some states, there have been 5 mile per hour increases on the freeways. And every time we increase the speed limit, we increase the number of deaths that occurs nationally as a result of traffic accidents on freeways. And that's simple math. If the average speed of everybody driving is 10 miles per hour, there are going to be no fatal accidents, right? Or very, very few. Whereas if the average speed of everybody driving is 80 miles per hour, you can see how statistically there's just going to be a lot more accidents. And when you look at 300 plus million people, half of whom are driving or whatever on X number of miles of freeway, driving X hours per day, the whole year, in a year, you're going to get thousands of accidents, tens of thousands of accidents, and thousands of fatalities because the speed limit is higher. Now, when you move from 75 to 80, you may only be increasing the fatalities by 50 per year, 500 per year, 100 per year. And that's a very small number. The odds of you being one of those 50 or 100 or whatnot are infinitesimal. But we agree that it's good for many people to get to work 2 minutes faster, or to get wherever you're going just a little bit faster. And we know, we are certain that a few people are going to die so that the rest of us can get there a little bit quicker. And that is just one of many examples of the ways that we buy in to this idea of Omelas, that we buy in to the child in the basement. So we have to reconcile that. And I'm not saying that we are evil people because we live in this kind of paradigm, or that if you don't do something to try and get out, or if you buy a cell phone or clothes, that you're doing something wrong. That is not the point. The point is that it's important to question everything and to take an honest look at ourselves and at our lives. So we have to ask ourselves, how much is Omelas like our America? And what are we doing? What can we do to try and make things better? Or is it better that a few people suffer so the rest of us can have these luxuries? That's utilitarianism, after all. So isn't that better? We buy into utilitarianism on the freeway and in lots of other ways. So it makes us ask these questions, and that's why it's a useful reading for our class.